The cold Minnesota air bit at David Chen's cheeks, a familiar sting that felt alien in the context of the scene unfolding before him. He pulled the collar of his coat tighter, his breath fogging in the space between his scarf and the lens of his phone. Down the street, the blue and red lights of squad cars painted the brick facades of Minneapolis in frantic, silent strokes. This wasn't Kabul. It wasn't Baghdad. But the tension coiling in the atmosphere, thick and suffocating, was a language he understood all too well. It was the universal syntax of a state turning its power inward. In Washington, they called it restoring order. Here on the frozen pavement, it felt like the preamble to a war. The Pentagon, according to the encrypted message from a source, Athena, had just placed 1,500 active-duty soldiers on prepare-to-deploy orders. Not for a foreign desert, but for these very streets. The thought sent a tremor through him that had nothing to do with the cold. A country that prided itself on being a beacon of democracy was preparing to point bayonets at its own citizens. The protests had started 3 days ago, a raw, spontaneous cry of outrage after the death of Rachel Woods. She wasn't an activist or a politician. She was a 26-year-old graphic designer, a U.S. citizen, caught in the chaotic net of an ICE raid targeting her apartment building. An agent, startled by her dog, had fired. The official report was a sterile narrative of accident and justified fear. But for the people now marching through the city, holding signs with Rachel's smiling face, it was something far more sinister. Terror, sanctioned and uniformed. The terror of a government agency that had become a blunt instrument of a cruel policy. David watched as a line of federal officers, clad in tactical gear that belonged on a battlefield, advanced on a crowd of shivering, chanting students. Their shields formed an impassive wall, their faces obscured by helmets. No justice, no peace. The crowd roared, their voices a desperate prayer against the encroaching silence of authority. He could see the anger, but beneath it, he could feel the fear. This was the laboratory. Minneapolis was the proving ground for the administration's new brand of domestic policy, a crude experiment in social control conducted with tear gas and the looming threat of military force. Back in his sterile hotel room, the noise of the street muted to a distant hum, David typed, his fingers flying across the keyboard. His editor, Sarah, had been on the phone an hour ago, her voice tight with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The White House is floating it, David. The Insurrection Act. They're actually talking about invoking an 1807 law to quell this. He remembered studying it in a constitutional law class, a historical artifact from an era of muskets and frontier justice. The act was a ghost in the machine of American law, a provision that allowed a president to bypass the Posse Comitatus Act and deploy the military on U.S. soil to suppress rebellion. It had been used before, in the darkest chapters of the nation's history, the Civil War, the forced integration of schools in the South, the Los Angeles riots of 1992. It was always presented as the absolute last resort, a fire extinguisher behind glass to be broken only in the direst of emergencies. But the president wasn't treating it like an emergency measure. He was brandishing it like another card in his electoral deck, a tool to project strength and dominate the news cycle. David's article began to take shape, weaving together the scene on the streets with the whispers from Washington. He quoted the language of the act itself, illegal obstructions, combinations, or assemblages, or rebellion against the authority of the United States. With a simple decree, the president could reclassify a civil protest as a rebellion. He could declare the citizens he was sworn to protect as an enemy insurgency. The death of Rachel Woods was the detonator, but the explosive charge had been packed for years, made of divisive rhetoric and the steady erosion of norms. The administration had already sent nearly 3,000 federal agents into Minneapolis and St. Paul, a show of force aimed squarely at the city's Democratic leadership. The message was clear: dissent would be met with overwhelming power. Communities asking for justice got flashbangs and tear gas. The military got put on a waiting list. The official narrative spun by the White House press secretary was one of protecting federal property and combating a surge of violent crime. But David had spoken to local leaders, to community organizers, to the mayor's chief of staff. They all told the same story. The White House was deliberately exaggerating the scope of the violence to justify a military-style occupation. It wasn't about safety, it was about politics. And the politics were getting vicious. The entire affair had erupted in the middle of a heated election cycle, throwing the 2024 midterms into chaos. The tragedy of Rachel Woods had shoved ICE and its brutal tactics into the spotlight, forcing a conversation the Democratic establishment seemed desperate to avoid. For months, they had been on the defensive, struggling to counter the president's relentless anti-immigrant rhetoric. Now, the tide of public fury was forcing their hand. Across the country, Democratic candidates were scrambling to express their outrage, promising to rein in the agency's power. But beneath the unified condemnation, old fissures were cracking open. Was the answer to reform ICE? To defund it? Or to abolish it entirely? Nowhere was this internal conflict more apparent than here in Minnesota, in the Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate. The state wasn't just the epicenter of the protests. It was home to one of the most contentious primary battles in the nation, a contest that would define the future of the party's immigration platform. On one side stood Peggy Flanagan, the state's progressive lieutenant governor. She was fiery, impassioned, and had come out swinging against the Trump administration, against ICE, and, most pointedly, against her primary opponent. On the other side was Angie Craig, a moderate congresswoman with a reputation for pragmatism. Flanagan's campaign was relentlessly attacking Craig's record, painting her as a political opportunist who had sided with the president on immigration when it was convenient. David had attended a Flanagan rally 2 nights ago in a packed community college gymnasium. The air was electric. My opponent, Flanagan had declared, her voice ringing with conviction, supported the Laken-Riley Act last year, a bill that gives this administration more power to detain undocumented immigrants. She voted for a resolution that expressed gratitude to ICE, wrapping it in a condemnation of anti-Semitism after an attack in Colorado, as if that somehow sanctified it. There is a clear line between that vote and the federal agents on our streets today. This primary defines whether Minnesota will have a senator loyal to our values, or someone who votes with Donald Trump and the Republicans whenever it's politically convenient. The crowd had erupted. David had managed to get a brief, tense interview with Craig the next morning. She was poised and polished, but he could see the strain around her eyes. She accused Flanagan of political grandstanding. My opponent is making her Senate campaign the focus right now, Craig said, her voice carefully measured. When she should be joining me to fight the Trump administration and the unconstitutional power grabs by the Secretary of Homeland Security. And that Laken-Riley Act she keeps talking about? Ironically, its provisions are now being used by legal aid groups to argue for the release of asylum seekers. Politics is more complicated than a 30-second attack ad. The bitter infighting was a microcosm of the party's larger paralysis. While the president was sharpening the tools of state repression and openly threatening military intervention, the opposition was mired in a debate over its own soul. They were arguing about whether the problem was ICE's mission, its budget, or simply its public relations. David's phone buzzed. It was Sarah. New polling just dropped from Navigator Research. It's brutal. He could hear her typing. Trump's approval on immigration is down to 38%. That's a 10-point drop from last year. And ICE, my God, the agency is toxic. 89% of Democrats have a negative view. 62% of independents. Even a quarter of Republicans have turned against it. He scribbled the numbers on his notepad. This wasn't just a progressive fever dream. It was a mainstream rejection of the administration's policies. There's more, Sarah said. 86% of Dems and 60% of independents believe ICE has been too aggressive. A third of Republicans agree. When you have a significant portion of the president's own party admitting the excess, the law and order rhetoric starts to sound like a cheap alibi. This, David thought, was the key. The decision to put 1,500 soldiers on standby didn't smell of security. It reeked of political desperation. The president was losing the argument, so he was changing the subject from policy to power. The message was unmistakable. If the Poles punish my immigration offensive, I will respond with more force, more boots on the ground, and the explicit threat of the Insurrection Act. It was a terrifyingly simple political calculation. He spent the next day on the streets, embedding himself with a group of clergy who were trying to act as a buffer between the protesters and the federal lines. He interviewed a young woman, a barista named Maria, whose uncle had been deported a year ago. Her eyes blazed with a fire that was equal parts grief and defiance. Rachel Woods was a citizen, she told him, her voice trembling slightly. They killed her by mistake. But what about the people they take on purpose? The people they hunt? My uncle wasn't a mistake. He was their policy. We are all Rachel Woods now. That evening, he got another message from Athena. It was a single, chilling line. They're moving pieces on the board. Not a deployment order. A readiness upgrade. He wants them to be able to move in 4 hours, not 24. The empire that once exported its wars was learning to treat its own cities as occupied territory. The same military apparatus that had been deployed to Kabul and Baghdad was now being calibrated for Minneapolis. The paradox was nauseating. The very government that enshrined freedom of speech and the right to protest in its founding documents was now classifying those activities as illegal assemblages that could justify a military response. Protest was no longer a right, it was a pretext. David stood at his window, looking down at the flickering lights of the protest encampment in the park below. A cold, devastating question hung in the air, a question he knew he had to put at the end of his article. If the president was willing to sweep away protesters in Minnesota using a 200-year-old law, what real limit was left? What firewall remained to stop an administration that had begun to view its own people not as citizens to be served, but as military objectives to be neutralized? The laboratory was fully operational. The dress rehearsal was underway. And from his lonely perch, David Chun felt like he was writing the first draft of an obituary for a republic.